Lammy's point of view, disproportionality in the criminal justice system has got worse. He stated, "I get so upset about my review because it has got worse, not better, since doing the review. The recommendations have not been fully implemented. If I was publishing a review today, I would go further than when I was commissioned to do the review 5 years ago." At the same time, it's probably true to say, if you look at the proportion of ethnic minority and Black people at the bar, it has gone up. It does look good. It's why it's really concerning that we have been so slow and so poor to appoint BAME judges and get a judiciary that is representative of the country. People are applying, but they are not getting through. I wanted to kind of provide a comment that Equal agrees with, that Clinks have made. For those of you who are not familiar with Clinks, they're the national infrastructure organisation that does a lot of policy and support for the sector in the justice system. They think that all sectors working in the criminal justice system must work to tackle racism and discrimination by ensuring that they are using evidence and examples of good practice to meet the needs of racially minoritized people. The voluntary sector should be at the forefront of this work, both highlighting evidence of racism and discrimination and seeking solutions alongside experts and organisations led and focused on racially minoritized people. Clinks supported the Lammy review to engage with the voluntary organisations in the criminal justice system. We have since worked to ensure that this engagement continued as the Ministry of Justice and HMPPS implemented the review's recommendations. Significantly, activity has been undertaken, and we welcome HMPPS's new focus on its race action plan. However, despite this disproportionality and unequal outcomes persist. And we certainly feel that's an appropriate, fair judgment. So there's definitely much to do to close the disparities that were highlighted 4 years ago and since. From Equal's point of view, we are definitely concerned about the overrepresentation of BAME young people in the youth justice system, and that's a deep concern, I'm sure, for many people. There's also a concern that Lammy recommendations and post-Lammy race equality work is seen as an add-on rather than an operational priority, especially post-pandemic. The lack of equalities posts within prisons is a cause for concern, and the willingness to divert staff from these posts when prisons are under pressure concerns us greatly. There's also been, from our point of view, the failure of HMPPS to introduce a digital data tool to date because of the pandemic. And clearly the pandemic has caused challenges for the prison service and probation service, so we understand that. But at the same time, 4 years on, we do want to see measurable progress. In terms of recommendation 31, for example, MOJ to bring together a working group to discuss barriers to subcontracting, which includes voluntary sector organisations, a need to increase engagement with the voluntary sector organisations, which has somewhat increased, but still needs further work. So I won't go into too many recommendations here because we've got much time to talk about them throughout the morning and early afternoon. And we want to make sure that we focus on them properly and that we have our speakers. I'm delighted to introduce now. I'm sorry to say that Sophia Bunsey is unable to join us today, but we are very grateful that Ishtiaq Ahmed, a colleague, will be joining us, who is the General Manager of the Khidmat Centre based in Bradford. Ishtiaq has been around, like me, for a very long time, 40 years experience in working in race equality in Bradford, and has made a big difference for communities there. And we're very pleased that he will be one of our speakers today. We also have Des Brown. Des is the Chief CEO of Spark2Life. He's a qualified person-centered therapist, an ordained minister, and has served as a prison chaplain. Des has lived experience and himself was charged with manslaughter at the age of 17 and went through the criminal justice system. He is a gifted communicator and regularly delivers trauma training and bespoke sessions at conferences, events, online webinars, and in the prisons in the UK. And he's a very close colleague of mine and someone I've got very high regard for, and I'm sure you'll value listening to Des. Last but not least, we've got Dr. Laura Janes. Laura is a solicitor and legal director of the Howard League for Penal Reform. She oversees the charity's legal service for people aged 21 and under in prison. She has been working with Specialist Advisory Board to create an anti-racist practical guide for lawyers in the criminal justice system. So we've got 3 great speakers, and they've all got 10 minutes each. And I'm going to do my very, very best as the chair to make sure we stick to the 10 minutes. So I will remind respectfully and politely the speakers when we're at the 10-minute stage. Okay. And we're going to start off with Istiak first. So welcome, Istiak. We look forward to hearing from you.
Good morning. Can you all hear me clearly?
All good.
Good. Thank you for that very comprehensive introduction, Jeremy. You have actually made my life a lot easier, because much of what I wanted to say, you actually said it. Yeah. So thank you for that. Sophia was going to be here, and due to she was taken away at the last minute, and I've been asked to step in. Obviously, Sophia, this is her area of specialism. She offers a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge and understanding in this area, particularly regarding the gender equality and Muslim women. So there's no way I can even hope to perform at that level. But I'll do my best. My opening comment would be that one thing is that yes, I have been around about 42 years around the scene of equality and race equality, and I'm pleased to say that I got another 6 days to survive, and then I'm packing my bag and going somewhere into walking into sunshine. Yeah. My first comment would be that we are in 2021, and I was hoping that back in the 80s and 90s, that I would be not sitting in 2021 actually still speaking about the same disparities, same inequalities, same issues, and same concerns in 2021. Yes, the progress on racial equality front has been there is some progress, but I think the progress has been slow and tiresome, and continues to be slow and tiresome. And where I sit, I still my observation is that there may be some willingness amongst institutions within the criminal justice system to change, but that change is so slow, and it's actually not making the necessary impact that we need to make. Within that context, David Lammy's review is something that is nothing new. I remember being involved in Stephen Lawrence inquiry back in the late 90s, very much so, and many of the recommendations that inquiry made in terms of how the criminal justice in its entirety needs to change to be more reflective, more representative, and more responsive to the BAME community. Those recommendations have been again picked up by the Young Review, as well as David Lammy, some in 2014 and 2017, 2016 to 17. So David Lammy's review is for me is important in a sense that what he does is that actually brings together concerns and issues that BAME communities have been talking about regarding criminal justice for the last 40 years that I have been around. But it brings them together and actually gives them that kind of sharp focus. And that was, I think, David Lumy's review is very important for it to be to inform our discussions and debate. My concern is again that, and as David Lamy himself has acknowledged, and you also alluded to it, Jeremy, that 4 years on, the progress on 35 recommendations of David Lamy, the progress is so so slow and so random that the danger was that the David Lamy's review would actually suffer the same fate as even Lord's inquiry and Lola Young's report and others. And I think in many ways, I think that David Lamy's kind of recommendations have been re-energized by Black Lives Matter kind of campaign, because that has actually reinstated that we need to actually focus our minds, and institutions need to look at themselves and look at how they address issues of the BAME communities. Yeah. So this is a kind of very interesting kind of a crossroad, and without actually apportioning blame, I think it is imperative that if we are going to do justice to the recommendations and the finding of the David Lamy, then institutions really need to change their style of working, their approach, and their kind of response to concerns which we talked about. I mean, one of the things that David Lamy has actually highlighted in his report was about the treatment of young Black nations in the criminal justice, and he talked about at that time 40% young people from Black Asian communities or from minority communities actually receiving very disproportionate and unfair treatment. That figure percentage probably has gone up to 50% now. So instead of actually improving things in many areas, things have actually gone from bad to worse. In my own community that I actually reside in, Muslim, if you talk about the male kind of population, prison population, then it is quite worrying. And the projections are that the Muslim prison population is going to significantly increase over the next 10 years, almost doubling itself. Do we see a serious engagement of the criminal justice family to really engage with this kind of growing concerns and issues? Do I see it? I have to be very honest that I actually don't see it. Yeah. And therefore, we need to actually refocus our energies and our resources and our efforts to make sure that happens. Yeah. In terms of our own projects, the Muslim women in prison and the work Sophia does, we will have to say that our journey has been challenging. It's been very interesting, and we actually do some of our success stories. Actually, we have to acknowledge that organization like Clinks, organization like Cadbury Trust, and your own organization has been very important in terms of actually supporting, encouraging, cajoling us, and helping us to move forward. The actual, I would say that our projects would have not actually gone from strength to strength if there was not input from organizations like yourself and Cadbury. So it's the community sector, it is the third sector, it's the voluntary sector that has come to our rescue. And I think the official dom within the Ministry of Justice have been perhaps rather too slow in recognizing our specialism, recognizing our contribution, and that continues to be. And I think one of the concerns that I pick up from the BAME community sector, particularly within the racial justice arena, is that there isn't a level of support, there isn't a level of encouragement, there isn't a level of resources which are actually directed at the BAME community voluntary sector. And so there is a serious issue about capacity, and there's a serious issues about our ability to be able to provide that essential intervention in terms of actually something. And I think our major partners need to recognize that and take that on board. You cannot deliver, as far as I'm concerned, racial justice in a country like Britain without listening to and without supporting and building the capacity. You can, institutions cannot move forward on their own. And I think that is an essential point that I would like to make. So we have to rethink in terms of actually how we resource and we support BAME communities, for BAME communities to come up with answers, solutions to our issues. And I think that is something. In terms of some of the other, and I'm going to conclude, some of the other areas that I think we need to look at, is that we are talking about a major cultural change in which our institutions work and respond to BAME concerns and issues. I believe that the institutional approach so far is still random, and the thinking within those institutions in terms of the BAME issues and concerns is not part of an integral part of the culture of those institutions. So the equality debate, racial equality debate in institutions is not embedded at all. One of the things which Stephen Lawrence inquiry talked about was the issues of trust and transparency as far as the BAME is concerned. We still talk about trust and transparency, and many institutions will actually admit and acknowledge that they don't have the level of trust and the level of communication engagement today. That still remains some 20 years from Stephen Lawrence's recommendations, and it's something that David Lammy also picked up. Institutions in terms of their representativeness, do they reflect the mix of the communities where the communities they're supposed to be serving? And I have to say that by and large, no. Do institutions have skills and knowledge about BAME communities in terms of actually how to engage, how to respond appropriately? My answer would be generally, there are some very good examples, but generally, I think overall the answer would be no. And that's another area. About skills and knowledge, actually, what is a training? What is a present? So there's a whole raft of something. And within all this, where I sit in terms of our own project, which is about gender equality. I'm going to say, as far as gender equality is concerned,
2 more minutes, please.
I will, as far as gender equality.
There will be a question and answer session just after the three speakers.
As far as the gender equality is concerned, I've looked at all the reports, and David Lammy also in particular. There is always a marginal reference to women and the needs of women, and particularly a very marginal reference to the needs of the BAME women and within the Muslim women. So I think all of the reports and all of the reports, they fall far short in terms of actually addressing the issue, gender equality issues, and particularly gender equality issues within the BAME community, and within that, the Muslim community. So those are some of my observations.
Thank you very much, Ishtiaq. Appreciate you saying all those important things in a very short time frame. Thank you very much. I'm going to move swiftly on to Laura. So Laura, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay, and just talk a little bit about the Howard League perspective on where we are and what needs to be done. So just for those of you who don't know about the Howard League, I ought to introduce ourselves. We have been operating in respect of penal reform in England and Wales since 1866, so a little while, and we work for less crime, safer communities and fewer people in prison. And we try and do that by doing two strategic aims. One is to create better justice for people who are in the system, but even more importantly, particularly for our discussion today, to try and stem the flow. And try and stop people, particularly people from ethnic minority communities, coming into the system in the first place. And we try and achieve that through a combination of policy, research, direct legal work, which is the bit I oversee for children and young people, where we have a confidential helpline where people can call in any weekday and get straight through to a lawyer. And we are also a membership organisation that takes no government funding. So just a quick kind of view on what we're seeing through our legal work at the moment. First of all, 2/3 of our callers for legal advice are Black and ethnic minority callers, for young people, which is an overrepresentation compared to the very high numbers within the criminal justice system and in custody in particular. And what we see routinely, and this has been a pattern throughout the 15 years that I have been working with young people in prison, is we see better outcomes for white people who are more likely to be championed by the staff around them and by external agencies. And conversely, we see worse outcomes for Black and minority ethnic young people, especially, I have to say, when it comes to the use of force and separation and isolation. And I have not seen any change to that in the last 5 years. And in particular, those young people who are brave enough and motivated to make complaints about discrimination, I find this a really distressing part of my job, because I've never known one to be upheld, not once. And the other thing I just wanted to raise is that Black and ethnic minority children are often passed over when it comes to diagnosis, which is something that Lammy did touch on. And that's especially the case with things like post-traumatic stress disorder and autism, where sometimes that disorder and difficulty can manifest in quite difficult and what's perceived to be challenging behaviour, but because they've not got the diagnosis, they're often punished for poor behaviour. Now, we know that one of the good stories in the criminal justice system has been that the number of children in prison has reduced dramatically. When I first started this work, there were 3,000 children in prison at any one time, 10,000 children coming through the prison gates each year. Now, as we speak today, that number's at around 600. So huge drop. But Black and ethnic minority children have been left behind. You can see here from the light blue line, that is the reduction in the number of white, mainly boys, and the darker line is the reduction in children from Black and ethnic minority communities. And as you said, Jeremy, you know, and David Lammy has said himself, the data speaks for itself. At the point of his review, of course, you know, it was 41% of all children in custody were from Black and ethnic minority communities. Today, it is over 50%, and 2/3 of all children on remand across the country. And of course, that striking, shocking figure of 9 out of 10 children remanded from London. And that, incidentally, because we do a lot of work with Transition to Adulthood Alliance, which you know, really champions the work and the need to think about the 18 to 25 group, that follows through that disproportionality, not in quite such high figures, but really elevated levels of disproportionality for the young adults, which wasn't particularly highlighted in the Lammy review and needs to be dealt with. So moving on to Lammy, absolutely, as others have said, really important piece of work, and shone a light, a really important light, and is really important to have that benchmark. You know, it is incredibly disappointing that the slow progress, and I really hear what Ishtiaq said in terms of slow, tiresome, random progress, but at least actually we're getting updates and we're getting information. And the idea of explain or reform is something that we at the Howard League really do think is a good principle. You know, if you can't, you've got to get the data, you've got to give a really good reason for it, or you've got to change your ways. Unfortunately, I think one of the big issues is that I would have liked to have seen in a major review like this is a focus more on the structural issues, and going back to that idea of stemming the flow. What are we doing to prevent, in the first place, the criminalisation of minority groups? And I think that's where we as a sector need to come together. I've just taken these images from the Youth Justice Board's Journey of a Child. Of course, we've got this really distressing data here that Black children are over 4 times more likely to be arrested than white children. And then the communities that people are coming from, that the proportion of people living in the deprived 10%, most deprived 10% of communities by ethnicity shows that is much more prevalent for Black and ethnic minority people. So people are coming from places of structural racism. And I think that was a gap in the report. Now, I do think that one of the big takeaways that we hear spoken about most, certainly in my experience in sort of high-level meetings and from officials and things, coming from the Lammy report, is this huge focus on guilty pleas. Now, my reading of what David Lammy was concerned about there was that the system itself, bearing in mind where people are coming from and whole lives of experienced accumulated discrimination, was not set up to engender trust and confidence of Black and ethnic minority communities. And for that reason, they were less likely to plead guilty. It feels to me very much that the message we're still now getting is Black and ethnic minority people do not plead guilty enough. And that seems to me to be a perversion, really, of what David Lammy was saying, and it seems to be as if the blame is still being shifted on to defendants from Black and ethnic minority communities rather than the system that needs to change. And I think that's I think that is a takeaway message that has become distorted over time in quite an unhelpful way. In terms of the evidence and the data collection, absolutely, this is really welcome. But as we've already said, so much of it has worsened since 2017. And apart from the increase in Black and ethnic minority lawyers, of course, as Jeremy already said, only 1% of judges are Black. So we really are very, very slow progress, if any progress, in terms of the judiciary. But it's hard for me to think of any area where the data has improved since Lammy. And I think you can really see that. I spent some time recently when HMIP published its annual report, HMIP being the Chief Inspector of Prisons, published its annual report where they take the comments and experiences directly from children in custody. And I went through and I collected all the information that was collected from Black and ethnic minority children. And just to highlight to you what the children themselves are saying, 57% of Black and ethnic minority children reported that they felt they could turn to a member of staff for help, but that was compared to 75% of white children. Only 72% of Black and ethnic minority children reported that they were given clean sheets each week, compared to 86% of white children. And this is the most troubling one of all, that 71% of Black and ethnic minority children reported they've been physically restrained in custody, compared to 59% of white children. And that's what children are saying 4 years on from the Lammy report. So it almost feels as if nothing has changed. So where do we go next as a sector, as a community? What's the Howard League thinking? I think the first thing I need to say is we all need to play our part. Jeremy mentioned an anti-racist guide for lawyers, which we've been developing with the support and help of Black Protest Legal Support, and also a really brilliant group of advisory board members from a range of different disciplines. And that is designed really to try and convert everybody's sense of outrage into action, and sort of to try and help lawyers, support lawyers to counter bias and prejudice wherever they see it very actively in their cases, with practical tips. And that, I hope, will be published next month. But I think that kind of process of all working together to think about how we could actively each play our part is probably very important, because things are not going to necessarily come top down for us. I do think that going forward, we need to focus on some of the areas that Lammy didn't focus on. So in particular, as I've already said, thinking about preventing criminalisation in the first place. Acknowledging structural racism, I think, is incredibly important because of the impact that has when somebody lands in the criminal justice system as an accumulated disadvantage. I think we need to work together to counter the anti-woke narrative, which ignores the reality of Black working class people's lives, especially following the Sewell report. We do need, I know that Lammy didn't want to focus on policing because there had been so much on policing, but we know there are going to be 20,000 more police officers on the street and a whole host of new crimes for them to discharge. And I think policing has got to remain a really important focus of attention. In terms of prosecution, you know, the prosecution service came out very well from the Lammy report, but in my practice, I see young Black men being charged with violent disorder rather than affray. I see them charged with robbery, whereas I see white clients are more likely to be charged with theft. I see, you know, why are young Black men charged with possession with intent to supply rather than simple possession? I think we need to get into some of the nitty-gritty there and work out what is going on, and particularly thinking about some of the other interesting progress that's been made, like the Youth Justice Board report, which looked at the kind of things that happen beneath the surface in the criminal justice system, so bias and risk assessment, which again feeds on structural racism that young people will have encountered throughout all their early lives. And I think particularly thinking about the police and crime bill, as we take a punitive turn, and there's no doubt that that is where we're going, there probably does need to be an enhanced focus on sentencing. And one thing that I've certainly on behalf of the Howard League have been raising for some time now is the idea that judges and magistrates ought to be required to record against their name the ethnicity, the crime and the sentence that they administer, so that we can really see what is going on and people know that they are being recorded against those outcomes, so that we can look at those decisions and who's making them and why. So those are just a few ideas really from me. So I'll stop sharing my screen. I hope I stuck to time, and we'll pass on.
Thank you, Laura. That was really interesting and very helpful, and a lot of important points were made there. I'm going to swiftly move on to Des. Welcome, Des.
Didn't speak. Yes. Hi, guys. Really appreciate having me here, and hopefully I'll just give a perspective of where I'm at and where Spark2Life is at as a service provider. Really appreciate the welcome as well, Jeremy, and what BTEC are doing. I think it's phenomenal work. Okay, so my perspective is really from a grassroots perspective. I'll talk a little bit about policy and I suppose my involvement and how I see the impact on the Lammy review. I think for me, having gone through the system and working with a lot of people of colour in our service, probably 85% of the service users are people of colour. Our teams, 90% people of colour, and our whole board are, again, people of colour. So our lens is very much about advocating for our communities. And, you know, I think what the Lammy review has done for us is it's caused me to be very much focused on the service users, and I'll talk about policies and kind of institutional racism in a minute. And it's been kind of enabled us to challenge the system and decisions that are being made for young kind of people from ethnically diverse communities. We do that intentionally. We do that at senior level. We do that on decision making. We do that in courts. And we're not scared in challenging issues of disproportionality, issues of the trauma that decisions are making on people of colour, and using the language. So I think what we've been able to do is use the Lammy review as a tool to be able to challenge the system with, because it's very clear evidentially that there is disproportionality, there is issues of unconscious bias, there is issues of unfair treatment, but we look at the individuals as well as the whole system. And I think for a lot of kind of service or a lot of organisations out there that are working with that cohort, I think it's a tool that can be used for that, similar to the Young Review and others. I think it's helped to secure funding. I think when you look at the Lammy Review, there's now focus on funding that can be put towards it. I think what we've got to be careful of is not pathologizing people of colour and people from ethnic diverse communities, because what it can say sometimes is that this cohort, this demographic has a problem. And that's linked to me to colonialism, which I'll come on to probably when I land at the end. I I think also I think it's also, yeah, I think it's important to be taught I think it's important to also have the courageous conversation with those people at grassroots levels, in councils, in youth offending teams, in probations. And what I mean by having a courageous conversation, call it out for what it is. Don't be scared in going forward, because I think that's the big difference between being a non-racist and anti-racist. I think there's a lot of people that will say, well, I'm not racist, but actually, are they anti-racist? And I think, you know, what we can do with this tool is say, well, actually, we can call it out. And it's upon us to all be anti-racist. I think, for me personally, as an organisation, we're very much grassroots operational, representing and advocating for the individuals. I think I've kind of come into the area because of my role as a CEO into looking at policy. You know, what's interesting with that, I think that's where the Lammy review has made little, if anything, no impact, sadly. I think it's shone a light, as people have said, and there's a few things that we can kind of refer on, but I think that's more to do with the system. If anything, I think it just reinforces the racism within the system. It highlights it. You know, and I think, again, I think of what BTEG are doing. There's obviously Charities So White that have talked about the power and privilege in the charity sector. It still exists for white-led charities. I think Clinks, which I'm a part of, and I look at, again, the ethnically diverse community and represent them and the charity sector, challenging prisons and probations around that, but it's committed to being an anti-racist organisation in September 2020. So again, it's looking at where some of its funding are going. Change 21, which is another organisation, a collective of activists, of Black-led activists that are kind of more so focused London, but going across the country, Black Men for Change. And so being in these spaces enables me to see the conversation that's being had. What I would say is when we look at the criminal justice system and even looking at the CRCs, which I know a recommendation was made by Lammy that more funding should go to Black-led organisations that have that cultural competence to be able to support their service users. What's interesting is how many Black-led, not Black-focused, Black-led, BAME-led organisations turn over more than £500,000 a year. Now that's a big issue. And the reason it's a big issue, because if they don't, and we're now looking at the reform of NPS, so everything's going back internally to the National Probation Service, and CRCs kind of is no longer from June. What we're finding there is that a lot of those small grassroots organisations that are doing phenomenal work can't get on to the dynamic framework because they haven't got the infrastructure. Therefore, again, the larger organisations will be getting the funding that I don't think are necessarily culturally competent, and I need to put it out there, partly because culture is defined by the leadership. And, you know, the leadership, in as much as the lens that you have and the lived experience that you have, is really, really important when you're trying to make a difference and make a change. So I think for me, that's where the Lammy review hasn't made much of an impact. If anything, it's highlighted the institutional racism. I think with Black Lives Matter, it's created a more robust conversation that's being had with the MOJ. I think with HMPPS also, a lot of people of colour are experiencing vicarious trauma after the George Floyd, and I think it's quite important because as professionals, if you're a person of colour and you've been in this space for years, and I commend those that have gone before me, people like Ishtak and Jeremy and others that have been in this a lot longer than me, it's quite traumatizing to continually see the stuff that's going on in their communities and the advocacy that they've been trying to give over the years. And I think that's important because it's awakened a lot of people, and there's a lot of pain there that needs to be addressed. And so I think we need to be aware of that as professionals and allow people to have that courageous conversation, but also be aware of what it ignites when we look at the institutional racism. When we're looking at reform, I think, you know, that's the big thing. People need to explain or reform. I think that's one statement that we can keep saying. Explain the disproportionality or reform. And if you can't explain it and you're not willing to reform, then what you're saying is this is acceptable. and it's not acceptable. I think when we look at the recent police crime and sentencing courts bill, what was interesting, the government has acknowledged that in its equality assessment that the changes in sentencing will further increase, they acknowledge this, racial disparity, yet it justifies the unequal impact of these changes as a proportionate means of achieving the legitimate aim of protecting the public. But it provides no evidence or reasoning in support of this claim. And that was written by Clinks to the powers that be to challenge them on this and how it impacts, again, disproportionality, or disproportionately, shall I say, the ethnically diverse community. When we look at the recommendations, and I will stop through some of the ones that I think, when you look at recommendation 5, you know, I think the big thing for me was the matrix. You know, I mean, what happened with that? Do you know it still exists? You can go, you know, if you go onto the Met Police matrix, and you can see that there's 202,298 males on there. Out of that is 1,840 of them are black. We're being specific here, black males. But what's also interesting is 1,501 of those 2,000 plus are actually green, which means they haven't been active in violent offences. And so what we're seeing here is, again, how black, you know, males are being targeted as being more violent. And again, this is where the system pathologizes. It says, if we're not careful, there's an abnormality with that ethnic group concerning their behavior and their actions. And I say that because that is an assimilationist's point of view. An assimilationist point of view is basically saying this is a benchmark, this is how people should behave, and this is how people should be. And if you look at colonialism, that's how it all started. That actually there is an abnormality in people that aren't necessarily white, and that would be the standard that they would put up. And I think that runs through the criminal justice system. It runs through the criminal justice system, and it's quite aligned because when it looks at rehabilitation, it's looking at changes people's behaviours and people's values, which is good, yes, but what standard are you using? Are you using a standard that is basically saying this is the model, and it doesn't take into account people's culture, people's lived experience, and how people are? I think some of the recommendations, again, as I kind of look to land now, I think recommendation 23, the MOJ and the parole board should report on proportions of prisoners released by offence and ethnicity. And I think the Youth Justice Board done a piece on that, and it breaks down again early years education, pre-court offences. I've kind of got the document here. People may or may not be familiar with it. It was done last year in August. And again, it shows the disproportionality in custody, reoffending. What's interesting with that, frequency of reoffending, white children had the highest rate of reoffences, 4.22. And it says Asian children had a rate of 3.46 and black children had a rate of 3.62. But you see, that's not reported. The narrative often is we have here young, violent individuals that come from ethnically diverse communities. And let me end with this. I think if I was looking at what would need to change within the Lammy review, one of the big things for me is focus on courts. I think magistrates specifically that have power to determine the trajectory of a young person's life, but haven't been trained, and, you know, to the level of how do they disassociate their personal views and from what they're reading in the newspaper, because they haven't had the training of necessarily a probation officer, a social worker, a psychologist, etc., to be able to actually see who is in front of them, knowing that the decisions they make that can often be personal can affect a young person's life. And the reason I highlight that is because it's been mentioned time and time again, there is an over-representation of the ethnically diverse community in the youth offending institutions. And so magistrates make those decisions primarily. It's the magistrates that do that. So the magistrates need training. And finally, I think mental health, again, is an area that a light can be shone. But I'll stop there, and because I know of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Des, much appreciated. I'm going to swiftly hand over to Sade, either to kind of introduce the next section or Payal. I don't think we can have time for Q&A right now, because I think we want to obviously make sure people can have a chance to speak and have a conversation in the break. So I'll hand over to Sade, and she will take it from there.
Hi everyone, so we're going to move straight into the breakout rooms because we want to make sure we have time at the end just to cover some of the questions. So if you have any burning questions, please keep a note and let us know what they are at the end. Can you all hear me? I'm always having technical difficulties with Zoom, and I'm going to stop saying, can you hear me, at some point after the 21st. So I'm going to move everyone into breakout rooms now. So Pyle will do that. And then we're going to get into the heart of the discussion and take questions at the end. So Pyle, if you just click when you get the prompt to enter your breakout room, that would be great. I'd just like to apologise to my group. We were in a little bit of a discussion there and we lost it just at the end when the room closed. I don't know if that happened to any of the other groups, but sorry about that.
Thanks, Shada. I'm conscious of the time. I'm very happy for you to kind of manage us through the next phase, whether you want to do some quick updates from each group or just do an open Q&A. I'm happy to go with what you think will be best.
I would say let's just do an open Q&A for now. If there's anything anyone wants to ask one of the speakers or just in general put to the organisations here, then please do. This is an open forum. We were going to do a bit of feedback, but I think when you see the report from Equal, that will provide you with all the feedback that you need. So I will share that with everybody that's been in this meeting. But yes, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat or pop your hand up if you want to say anything, or just take your mic off. Anyone? So in terms of the slides, I think we'd be happy to share them. Laura, if you're happy to share your slides with us, then yeah, we can pass them on. So Jasper, yes, happy to do that, no problem. So Amal has asked, whether racial disparities in our criminal justice system can be addressed within the current legislative framework, or is it necessary to revoke certain powers? For example, the Misuse of Drugs Act and Section 60 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act. Is it within the DNA of these powers to produce and reproduce discriminatory outcomes? Any thoughts on that from our speakers? Laura?
I suppose as a lawyer, I better say something. Look, I think this, there is, if I had my way, we would do a discrimination audit on all our laws, because clearly we can see that it's within this framework that we have decades and decades of discrimination and unfair outcomes. However, we know that at the moment, as Des said so eloquently in his presentation, we know that we are on the cusp of introducing a whole range of new laws that are going to make the situation far worse, and we're going into that with eyes wide open and justifying it. So I think, yes, of course, in an ideal world, there is room to change the legal framework, and we ought to do that. But I also think that from a pragmatic perspective, what we do need is a huge cultural shift to kind of tackle structural racism from the outset. So that's my kind of thoughts, really.
Thank you, Laura. Sammy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm kind of leading on from what Laura just said, a question to the speakers, really. The point that Des made and Laura just alluded to about the legislation that's currently being enacted is moving us further away from sort of the equal outcomes that we're looking for. Where does the panel members then think we should be putting our energies and our efforts to have the greatest impact for change? And Laura, you just mentioned about a more structural approach in terms of dealing with some of the fundamental structural issues. What does that look like on the ground for organisations that want to put their time and efforts into areas that might have the greatest impact and long-term outcome, rather than maybe just talking to government, which clearly not interested?
I'll answer some of that as best as I can. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Des.
Yeah. I think in short, and what's quite challenging, I think when you're leading a charity, you become, especially a lot of small grassroots Black-led charities, is you become quite focused on developing your service provision and looking out for the service users. And so it's hard sometimes then to challenge the structures, because it means going to meetings, being part of various different groups, forums. And again, the people that may have significant voices or should be around the table can't be around the table because they're not getting paid to be around the table, because they're also delivering as well as developing and managing their charities. That said, I think one of the key areas is around the leadership and the senior leadership of these institutions. And I think that's where, we had a bit of a discussion in our forum. The truth is everything rises and falls on leadership. And if we're talking about, training and development, it's very hard to train and develop a mindset and a way of thinking that in itself is either unconsciously biased or just outright racist. And the only way I think we're going to genuinely see change is when we have more of a reflective community at places of decision. And I think and that's starting at whether it's youth offending teams, looking at HMPPS, looking within the police. Unless there's people of colour and people from the ethnic diverse communities that are on these positions, I don't think we're going to get change. And even then, it's going to be a challenge because you've got a culture that then you've got to deal with. And a culture in itself can take, years and years to change. So yeah, for me, in answer to your question, Sammy, I think until we get people in those positions, we won't see the change that really we desire. Thanks,
Des. I'm conscious where the time is, and I'm sure people are getting hungry for lunch. I'm going to wind up and say thank you to all the participants for finding the time today to join us. We really appreciate it. I'd like to thank our speakers, Ishtiaq, Laura and Des, and obviously Sade and Payal for all the organising and getting the speakers lined up and encouraging people to attend. Thank you very much. I do want to plug our next two events. We have On the 21st of June at 10 a.m, the Criminal Justice Alliance and the Centre for Justice Innovation, they'll be looking at working with police and crime commissioners to build trust and tackle race inequality. On the 7th of July at 11 a.m, we have Clinks and the Barrow Cadbury Trust, and they'll be looking at the role of the voluntary sector and trust and foundations in tackling race inequality in the criminal justice system. And we definitely would encourage you to join those next two sessions and keep the thread going if you can. And as Sade said, we will produce a short report at the end of the 3 sessions as well, and make sure those in the positions of power and influence receive that report, and it'll inform our work as well going forward. So thank you very much for today, and we really appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day. And see you
Sorry,
soon.
one shameless plug before everybody goes. It's a very, very shameless plug.
Yes,
But tomorrow we are launching our petition against the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, and we would encourage you and your organisations to sign it. It will be going live. So I think Pyle's put the link. If you just keep in touch with our Twitter, you'll see when it's posted. So please support that if you can. And there's a detailed briefing attached to it, which will explain all the concerns that we have. So thank you.
Thanks, Sade. Take care, everybody.